Turkish descent. Shajara al-Durr's story is quite distinct to the women mentioned so far. She is said to have been beautiful and intelligent, and we don't know if she truly felt affectionate for the prince or used it as an opportunity to free herself from slavery and bear a child, which led to her marriage and rising up the ranks. The concept of upward mobility is not unique to that era. Her story is an example of how a slave girl who probably was converted into Islam after marriage went on to become such a significant woman in Islamic history. And while there isn't an exact feminist movement or a plethora of feminists, there are notable women who advocated for equality for Armenians. One of them, Nazali Vahan, the mother of the author Serpui Dusap, can be considered one of the earliest feminists in Armenian history. Vahan opened a girls' school in Constantinople and also set up the Charitable Women's Association. Vahan's daughter, Serpui, was educated under her mother and brother's care, went on to become one of the first women to write about equality in employment, society, and education. Zabel Asador, known by the pseudonym Sybil, was a poet, writer, publisher, educator, and philanthropist. She co-founded the nation-devoted Armenian Women's Society, an organization that supported the establishment of Armenian girls throughout the Armenian populated districts of the Ottoman Empire. Much of her writing is dedicated to women and progress. Zabel Yesayan is today probably one of the most well-known female Armenian writers. Her work covered political issues of the time, such as the genocide and the status of Armenian women. She was included in the list of intellectuals targeted by the Young Turks on the 24th of April, 1915. After living in France for some time, Yesayan moved to Soviet Armenia in 1926, where she taught French and Armenian literature at Yerevan State University and continued to write prolifically. During Stalin's purges, she was accused of nationalism and arrested. She was never found, and it is said that she died in one of the prison camps in Siberia. Yesayan also used pseudonyms to publish work about the Turkish atrocities during the genocide, and also wrote about women's rights. She will have been one of the first of many women to start raising awareness through witness testimonies the disproportionate effect wars have on women. The Turkish writer and feminist Elif Shafak is quoted as saying Zabel Yesayan's book, In the Ruins, is her favorite book no one has heard of. Silva Kaputyan was an Armenian poet and political activist, a much adored Armenian writer from the 20th century. She is recognized as the leading poetess of Armenia, despite living under the Soviet regime. Kaputyan never shied away from her patriotism for Armenians. She gained the favor of many in the political sphere, and although strictly not a feminist, through her writing, she promoted liberty and challenged the male hierarchy through her activism well into the 90s. One woman that stood out and stands out for me is Shushanit Kurgunyan. She was one of the most prominent feminist writers through her poetry, and I want to read one of her poems, which was translated by Shushan Avikyan. Excerpts from the poem, I Weep for You, Armenian Woman. I know not how to cry, but I often weep for you, Armenian woman, for your wretched life of enslavement, your lot and condition. Your patience turned to stupor, your slumbering soul is my very own wound, my pain. Have you heartless men heard the lullaby song the Armenian woman sings, rocking her child on her knees? Surely this song is silent expression of incurable pain caused by an unnatural life. This song, in the houses of wealthy and poor, is a doleful requiem of buried memories, a synchronous rhythm accompanied by tears that dull the luster of young cheeks. There are many others who I haven't mentioned, such as Siranush Zarafyan, Elgis Gasparian, and others. It's not easy, but if you search long enough, you will find their work. I have also included, as I mentioned earlier, some useful resources for anyone that wants to follow up and read more about some of these women. And then there are the women who have regained prominence, such as the first Armenian female diplomat, Diana Apkar. It's funny, quite a few people messaged me in the run-up to this event asking me to include Diana Apkar, which I was going to do, but it goes to show that she's obviously gained real prominence in the last few years. She was actually one of the first female diplomats in the 20th century too. There have been recent exhibitions. There was one that I visited at the Watertown Armenian American Museum, and a documentary celebrating her life and her heroic humanitarian work. She was appointed honorary consul to Japan during Armenia's short-lived independence. In the documentary Stateless Diplomat, Diana's daughter uncovers her grandmother's heroic efforts to support Armenian refugees from the genocide. It is worth noting that Armenia, right from the birth of the First Republic, adopted universal suffrage and paved the way for 3 women to get elected into parliament. And they were Berjui Persegyan, Katerin Zalian-Manukyan, and Varvara Sahakyan. In fact, France, I think, got universal suffrage after the war, so 1945 and 1944. It's 1945, I think. But that just gives you some context. And the US gained universal suffrage in 1919, if I'm not mistaken. I want to dedicate some of my presentation to the women who tried to make a difference to the genocide. Women like Sosi Mayrik, Khanem Ketinjan, and Aurora Mardikanyan. Many of us have been reacquainted with Aurora's story thanks to the beautiful production by Bars Media, Aurora's Sunrise, and never seen before archived interviews. But you may have not heard of Sosi Mayrik, who fought alongside her husband from 1895 against the Turks and Kurds. She lived an adventurous life and was relayed to rest in an Armenian military cemetery many years later. Khanem Ketinjan was a fierce woman who joined the resistance and fought back against the Turkish massacres in 1915, ultimately dying while protecting others. It's important to remember these women because often they are depicted in history as just a name or victim, unlike some of their male counterparts. As we move on to the late 19th century, I wanted to dedicate a section to Ashken Hovakinyan, otherwise known as Agnes Joaquim. She was a Singaporean Armenian who bred Singapore's first hybridized orchid, Vanda Miss Joaquim. The name has been changed to Singapore Orchid or Papillant Miss Joaquim, I suspect after a local celebrity drag queen changed her name to Vanda Miss Joaquim. Joaquim was inducted into the Singapore Women's Hall of Fame in 2015. She was a horticulturalist and regularly won prizes at flower shows. Her hybrid orchid was later chosen as the national flower of Singapore. The first botanical garden is very close to the Armenian church in Singapore. I'm sure many of you have been. It is the oldest church, Christian church in Singapore, and I know we all love going to raffles for drinks when visiting Singapore, which of course I do too, but the first place I wanted to revisit after so many years was the church and Armenian Street. Of course, the new botanical gardens are a marvel, but nothing like imagining what it looked like all those years ago. It's incredible that a woman of Armenian descent has played such a critical role in the country's national identity. So some of these photos best was taken December 2022 when I was out there for work. And that's just behind the church, for those of you that haven't visited. And if you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful space. Very, very tranquil. Next we have our female scientists. There are 3 I want to focus my attention on, but there are many more. And it's worth noting that Armenians have always excelled in the sciences, and in modern-day Armenia, we have one of the highest percentage of women working in tech in the world. That is an incredible achievement when you consider how many events I attend where we talk about how to close the gap in this space for women. One of them is Paris Pishmes de Avedissian. Paris Pishmes was a Mexican Armenian astronomer who until today is highly regarded by the astronomy community. In fact, in Mexico, they celebrated her for Women's Day in 2021. She discovered 3 globular clusters and 20 open clusters. Pishmish joined the Observatorio Astronómico Nacional at Tacubaya, which was part of the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, and worked there for 50 years. In 1955, Paris began teaching formal astronomy courses, which was a first for Mexico. She tutored several students who became professional astronomers, and as a result of the 80 astronomers currently at the Institute, a relatively high proportion, 25%, are women. Alan Ushterian was the first Iranian astronomer and physicist. She founded and directed the Solar Observatory of the Institute of Geophysics at the University of Tehran. And Anna Kazanjan Longobardo was a successful engineer and company executive. She helped develop military and weather radar systems that were used in over 100 locations around the world. She was one of the founders of the Society of Women Engineers in the U.S., and she was one of the first women to work aboard U.S. Navy submarines, destroyers, and other vessels. Incredible achievements. She passed away in 2020. And I want to move on to the more fun parts, bringing us closer to the modern era, the divas. As we move on to more contemporary women, I want to highlight Armenian musicians, celebrities, and actresses. From Kathy Berberian. For those of you that don't know her, she was a mezzo-soprano, American, based in Italy, and she passed away in 1983, if I'm not mistaken. I am going to, yeah. So she did this thing called stripsosity in a sort of comic format. And hopefully Nord's right, she can tell you about her friendship with Kathy.
Yeah. Blow, blow.
So she takes a comic strip format and turns it into onomatopoeia.
I see, and I've got naturally curly hair. Do you like girls with naturally curly hair? Good grief. She's gonna take us right. So, knock, knock. Oh, black. Grunt, knock, glad, rub, come in.
So I'll let Marissa tell us a little bit more about her when she's here. And then, of course, there's the Bulgarian-French singer Sylvie Vartan, whose father was Armenian. A pop icon in France, for those of you not familiar with her. And of course, there's Cher, who needs no introductions. She is quite fabulous. If you've been on the planet for more than 10 years, she's iconic, her quotes are legendary, she is the queen of reinvention, sorry Madonna, and quite possibly a vampire if we are to believe the memes, and one of the original divas alongside Diana Ross and Shirley Bassey. Cher was born in 1946 to an Armenian father. She has been a staunch activist on LGBT rights and HIV/AIDS prevention. She is known as being a philanthropist and over the years has supported many Armenian causes, notably the earthquake in 1988 and after the First Nagorno-Karabakh War. She was very active during the 2020 war as well, and everything that's happened since. I want to share a story with you because you will have noticed I put a very old article there. I was only 5, I swear. It's something that sort of stuck with me because it was all about Cher's perception in the Armenian community and how much that's changed since I was a child. When I was young, we were asked by the local Cypriot Armenian paper to write about famous Armenians. I was already fascinated with Cher, and my father had a biography of hers, so I decided to write about her. After the feature came out, we were chastised by an elderly retired teacher. My sister also wrote a feature, and hers was on Jack Kevorkian, aka Dr. Death. So what can I say? We had very progressive parents. But firstly, writing in English in an Armenian paper, and secondly, highlighting a woman and a man who were a disgrace to the Armenian community. The retired teacher happened to be my friend's grandmother, which I found out afterwards when I went to an Armenian event, and this letter to the editor was the talk of the evening. I was young, but I was mad. My parents and us got together and wrote a strongly worded letter calling out her prejudice. Granted, Dr. Death isn't a defensible person, but should we not discuss him and his cultural relevance at the time? Arguably, he brought the topic of euthanasia into the spotlight. Cher, on the other hand, I couldn't understand what made her disgraceful. I knew what my friend's grandmother was getting at, but to me it seemed like such an archaic way of looking at the world and women. It's ironic because in early history, Armenians were quite progressive for their time. Mkhitar Ghosh's 12th century code of laws actually advocated for equality between husband and wife. Living under repressive regimes for centuries, it seems, we went back instead of forward. I was reading something recently, and the author wonders where Armenia would have been if we had not been absorbed into the Soviet Union. Even today, despite all the progress we see, the same labeling and criticisms are levied against women. Domestic violence is still a serious issue in Armenia and globally. Femicide is a real thing. There are still societal views about Armenian women that are being passed down from generation to generation. How an Armenian woman should act, when and who she should marry, when she should have children. The list is endless. Important to note, these are universal challenges and not unique to Armenians. I was reading up about Lucy Sarayan the other day, daughter of William Sarayan, a progressive by all accounts, and she recounted in an unpublished interview with The Times, he was angry I hadn't done those conventional things, marry and have children. He resented the freedom I took, and yet he gave me a great sense of freedom. This is the great dichotomy for me when I think about Armenian women. How we are revered in Armenian history and culture, and even today are put on a pedestal. Think Meir Hayastan looking over all of Armenia, and yet we still perpetuate anachronistic ideals about women and their perceived roles. Think the Kardashians, particularly Kim, who is the last woman I'm featuring tonight. We all know of her. Most people you ask say they don't like her. But we expect her to be there for Armenians when we need her, despite their disdain for her. I personally have no opinion about her, but respect her as a woman, a savvy woman who, against all odds, went on to build successful brand after brand. I'm always rooting for women. Madeleine Albright used to say, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help others. Thank you all for attending and letting me talk about these remarkable women. There were many other notable women I would have liked to talk about, Ida Carr, Zabel Panussian, the list goes on. So many women to discover, including the everyday women. I want to call these women out because much like the women in my presentation, they too are fighting battles, writing their own stories, making their own mark in the world, just not necessarily the epic way or the ones we deem worthy enough to write about. Everyday women who are out there trying to make it in the world, whether they are working, parenting, or doing both, caring for relatives and paying the bills. The role of a woman is not one-dimensional, and all these women's stories are told through a particular lens, through their successes and failures. But we are more than that. They are more than their work, and they are more than how successful their marriages or how many children they had. We don't judge men on those terms, so let's start changing the way we revere women.
And she said, yes, I need a mime. And it was a very interesting piece. It was called Recital. Had an orchestra off stage, a pianist on stage, and a pianist off stage. And it was about the fragmentation of a woman singer and how she begins to lose her mind. And she just starts singing snippets of her repertoire. You know, just a fragment, and then the orchestra comes in, and the piano comes in, and then she says something. It's a fantastic piece, and my job was to bring bits of costume and put them on her to symbolize what was going on in her mind. And at the end, there was this huge black cage made of organza, and she was in that, and I was the wardress in the asylum. And we did a tour together in Italy. We were going to go to the States, but we did performances in London. And I brought her into the Armenian community. I begged her to come to a cocktail party here, so she could meet some Armenians. And then Loris Tuknavorian was doing a festival. Susan and no one will remember that. Do you remember the music festival? I said to Loris, we've got the greatest Armenian singer, Kathy, let's persuade her to do a concert. And her concert was called From Bach to the Beatles. And she loved contemporary, she loved modernist art, Art Nouveau. All her furniture in Milano in her house was Art Nouveau. And so she had an Art Nouveau stage, and she wore a huge gown by FT, and she would start singing Bach and go through a repertoire which eventually ended up with the Beatles. It was a wonderful recital. and she did that for the Armenian festivals. And she was just outstanding. And every so often, whenever she came, she would bring me a gown. And by this time, she had put on quite a bit of weight. And she would say, I want you to wear this. And I'll try it on now. We'd be in her hotel room. And I would put this on, and she would look at it. And she would start telling the stories of the concerts and the recitals that she had sung in that dress. I mean, some of them are so grand, you know, that I can only wear them at very formal occasions. But this is the least grand. And so I'm honouring Kathy, my dear friend. Thank you very much. I want to also thank Tatiana for all the work that she does, all the charity work that she does, the Archeonidis. I knew she was going to be a good one. And she did eventually become the chair of the trust. She initiates all kinds of things. She's one of the most fantastic people I know, and brave and articulate and imaginative, and she is working with the oceans, which is so important. She's not interested, passionate about that, and she also works for herself, introducing other people, introducing new projects.
Called Common Guts, and this is a painting actually from our house by Osman of the century.